Well, welcome everyone to another one of our events in the Laurier Military History webinar series. Of course, my name is Eric Story. I'm sure many of you know that by now, but for those who don't, that is my name. I will be the host for this evening. I am the outreach manager at the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies, as well as a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University, where I am currently on a brief hiatus. And yes, I do really need a haircut. Now, before I get into tonight's proceedings, I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the extensive history of the land in which the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies, as well as our partner, the Region of Waterloo Museums, reside. Both of us are located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. In 1701, this land fell under the dish with one spoon treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, a treaty that was part of the Great Peace of Montreal in the same year that marked the end of the Beaver Wars of the 17th century. It represented and continues to represent today an eternal agreement to not only share and protect resources, but also to solve conflicts peacefully. 80-some years later, in 1784, the Haldemand Proclamation was signed between the Haudenosaunee and the British Crown following the American Revolution, and the Haudenosaunee were given a tract of land that extended 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from just north of Orangeville today to its source at Lake Erie. Today, this treaty territory remains the homeland of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities, as well as the home of many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and acknowledging their presence in the past and present reminds everyone of the responsibilities we all hold as treaty people. Now, again, I know I say this every single time we have one of these webinar series events, but again, I'm truly excited for this evening because just like last month when we were able to bring in Gwen Darkangelis from New York State, because of the nature of doing Zoom in a digital age, or doing these webinar events in a digital age because of the pandemic, we've been able to reach out to so many more people, not only in terms of people that are actually coming in to watch these webinars, but also in terms of the speakers. And so tonight we were able to bring in a historian from the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm sure many of you know who she is. She is a scholar of the First World War. And I guess in an earlier part of her career, she would have described herself as a French historian of the First World War, but now describes herself instead as a historian of the First World War more generally. A graduate of the University of Winnipeg and the University of Toronto, she received her PhD from Georgetown University. Her book, Your Death Would Be Mine, Paul and Marie Perot During the Great War, won the F. Russell Major Prize from the American Historical Association and the Society for Military History Distinguished Book in Biography. And tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Martha Hanna, our speaker, but just briefly before I turn it over to Martha for tonight, I would like to let you know that we have made a great agreement with McGill Queen's University Press, where they were able to offer Martha's new book, Anxious Days and Tearful Nights, upon which this talk tonight is based, at a discount for 20%. So at any point during the event, I would highly recommend you to go to McGill Queen's University Press website, mquup.ca, and enter the code MQF2 at discount, and you will receive a 20% off discount for purchasing that book. And I will make sure to put that into the chat function at some point after I've turned it over to Martha. The last thing that I'll say again before I turn it over to Martha, I'm droning on too long already, is that throughout the talk, if kind of questions come to you, don't feel like you need to hold them in until the end. You can see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function, and you can open that up and you can type in your question. And when you do, please tell me where exactly you're coming from, because when I read out the questions and ask Martha at the end of the talk, I would like to let people know where the people that are asking the questions are coming from. So with that said, let me turn it over to Martha and enjoy her talk called Anxious Days and Tearful Nights, How Canadian War Wives Experienced the Great War. Martha, I'll turn it over to you.
Eric, thank you. And thank you to the Laurier Center for this very gracious invitation. I'm enjoying being back in Canada virtually. I wish I could be there in person, but obviously circumstances do not permit that right now. I want to spend about 45 or 50 minutes talking about how Canadian war wives experienced the stresses and anxieties that became part of their daily lives, especially in 1917. And you might ask, why focus on 1 year? Why focus on 1917? And as a historian of the First World War, obviously one of the arguments I would make is that 1917 is a year of profound significance for the history of the war, for the history of 20th century world. It was, of course, the year of the Russian revolutions. It was the year when the United States finally entered the war. From the vantage point of Canada, it was the year of Vimy, of Hill 70, and of Passchendaele. And it was a year that put extraordinary stresses on the women who were married to men serving in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And so what I want us to think about over the next little while is how the circumstances of 1917 had a direct or sometimes indirect effect on the daily lives of about 80,000 Canadian women who were married to men who served in the CEF. And although they might not have been directly affected by things like the Russian Revolution, they were certainly affected by some of the persistent features and characteristics that emerged in late 16 and certainly into 1917. Factors that would shape their daily lives and that would ultimately contribute to an anxiety and a degree of stress that is captured both in the title of my book, Anxious Days and Tearful Nights, but that was first articulated by Arthur Meehan when making a case for conscription in Canada in 1917. For the Canadian war wives that we're going to be talking about and thinking about today, I want to focus on three aspects of late 16, early 1917 that will have a very direct effect on their lives. The first is that the winter of 1916 to 1917 was uncommonly cold, even by Canadian standards. And this bitter, brutal, long, cold winter will make the challenges of managing a household, which of course was necessary for women whose husbands were serving overseas, will make the challenges of managing that household ever more extreme. So let's keep in mind that this is a very, very long, hard winter. The second factor that I want us to think about and understand why it affects Canadian war wives in a very direct way is the decision by the German state in February of 1917 to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And the point that I will make is that for Canadian war wives, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare influences their lives in one of two ways. For Canadian women who stayed in Canada for the duration of the war, submarine warfare interrupted the regular transmission of mail, both to the front so that they could stay in touch with their husbands, and from the front back home so that they could be reassured that their husbands were still alive. So for Canadian war wives in Canada, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare is going to be a source of considerable disruption and anxiety. For those Canadian war wives who chose to go to Britain during the war, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare is going to affect their lives in a very different way. And we're going to explore that in a few minutes. Third, and this is the point that I'm sure all of you are well aware of, 1917 was a pivotal year in the military history of Canada, at Vimy, at Hill 70, at Passchendaele. And knowing that their husbands were engaged in these fundamentally important military confrontations contributed to an ever-increasing state of unease and anxiety in the minds and everyday lives of Canadian war wives. So these three factors, a really bad winter, the resumption of submarine warfare, and knowledge that their husbands were serving in battle after battle in 1917, all converge to create a sense of culture of deep unease and anxiety. So that's where we're heading. Before we get there, I want to just give a very brief overview of how it was that married Canadian men chose to enlist in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, when they chose to enlist, and then how that will affect the experiences of the wives and children at home. As was true more generally in the CEF, we can see three distinctive waves of voluntary enlistment by married men in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. In the initial months, in August, September, October of 1914, we see that married men often chose to enlist for economic reasons. One example, a man by the name of Jack Howe, who lived in Toronto with his wife and quite extensive family, enlisted, and as he explained in a letter to his wife, he said, "I have been told by the officer that all wives and family will be looked after well and be lots better off than those with their husbands that's in Toronto." And so his calculation was that by enlisting, he could provide a degree of economic security for his wife and children. He also had emotional attachments to the old country, to England. And so there were other reasons that motivated him to enlist, but certainly economic considerations were very, very important. The second wave occurs after the first Canadian engagement at Second Ypres in the spring of 1915, and we see a consistent uptick in the enlistment of married men through the summer of 1915. And one example, we will be referring to this man and his wife again later on, is of Harry Hilliar. He was 38 years old when he chose to enlist in September of 1915. He had a wife and a son just more than 1 year old. He also had emotional connections to the old country. So he was torn between his desire to stay in Montreal and take care of his family and his sense that he needed to contribute to the war. And then the third and largest uptick in the enlistment of married men comes in the early months of 1916. And this is really important for the bigger story because it means that many of these men who enlist in January, February, March of 1916 will train in Canada through most of 1916 and then will be shipped overseas by the end of 16, ready to participate in those iconic battles of 1917. One example, George Timmins enlisted from Oshawa in March of 1916. He had a wife and 3 children at home, and the baby was just barely out of diapers. So he had been thinking about enlisting, but he wanted to make sure that his wife would be able to cope in his absence. And so he waited until he felt confident that she could manage things on her own. And then he enlisted in March of 1916. As he said later, as he was sitting in a muddy, damp, horrible trench, he said, "We considered all sides of the question before my enlistment. What he didn't consider was that he was going to be serving in France for more than a year, which was what he had initially anticipated." So let's think about how the bitterly cold winter of 1916 to 1917 shapes the experience of the war. If we look at it from the big picture, we know that this bitter winter, which afflicted Europe as well as North America, had a direct effect on undermining food supplies in Germany, which will be very, very critical to the way in which Germany responds to the war in 17 and 18. This is what's known as the Turnip Winter of 1916 to 1917. The bitterly cold winter that afflicted Russia began to let up in the last days of February and early March of 1917. And historians of the Russian Revolution have argued that as the weather finally relented at the very end of February, the beginning of March, women who had suffered from high prices and food shortages in Petrograd took to the streets to protest the failures of the Russian state to address their very legitimate basic needs. And so it was the end of this bitter winter that made possible the protests that ushered in the Russian Revolution. In Canada, the winter of 1916 to 1917 made the challenges of everyday life for Canadian women whose husbands were serving overseas extremely challenging. We take for granted, and my brother mentioned this to me just a few weeks ago, that when it's cold outside, we go inside, we turn up the thermostat, and everything is comfortable. Not so in 1916 and 1917. Canadians, whether their husbands were serving overseas or not, had to begin to prepare for winter in the summer preceding the onset of winter. So Harry Hilliar, who had enlisted in the fall of 1915, was particularly anxious in the summer of 1916 that his wife, Jenny, be prepared for the onset of winter. Long before he knew that this was going to be one of the worst winters in Canadian memory, he was insistent that she take the steps necessary to protect the home and to make sure that she would have the coal supplies that she needed, the wood that she needed, and that the doors would be protected, the windows would be taped up, and so forth. So in the summer of 1916, Harry writes to Jenny, "Don't forget to paste the windows and doors upstairs before winter starts. Put more ashes around the front side of the concrete step that leads upstairs, and that will protect the step and the water pipes from frost. In fact, you can build the ashes level to the top of the step if you have enough to spare." So think if we had to do that every fall in order to make sure that the water pipes in our houses or apartments didn't burst. He continued on this thread in July of 1916 and gave very detailed instructions to Jenny as to how to weather strip and weatherproof the windows in their duplex. He even sent home pictures and drawings of precisely how she was to reinforce the doors and windows to keep the drafts out and to make sure that she would be prepared for winter. And then he said very, very wisely, he said, if you have any money, why not get in 3 tons of coal this summer while it is cheaper? That was in July of 1916. And he was urging Jenny to prepare for the winter. And he was wise to do so because Canadians across the nation discovered that in late 16 and early 17, it became more and more difficult to secure coal supplies at affordable prices. There were miners' strikes in the West that reduced the supply of coal. As the US ramped up its industrial production in advance of going to war, the inflow of coal from the United States into southern Ontario was reduced. So the coal supply in central Canada was subjected to these disruptions from the United States. And as a consequence of these various disruptions to the coal supply, we can tell that the price of coal doubled between May of 1915, when it was about $6 per ton, and February of 1917, when it was $10 a ton. So on top of the logistics of making sure that a home was well prepared for winter, there was also the challenge of finding the money to make sure that you could stay with an ample supply of coal and of wood. By the spring of 1917, people in Canada were speaking ominously of, quote, a coal famine. So the effect of the coal shortage is just to compound the challenges of everyday life that war wives had to contend with while their husbands were serving overseas. And remember, by this point, most of the men who had enlisted in 1916 or earlier were in England or were serving in France. And so were not in a position to help their wives with these very basic chores. The second factor that will make the lives of Canadian war wives more complicated, more stressful, more anxious is the decision by the German state to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. As you will probably remember, they had used unrestricted submarine warfare through the spring of 1915, but following the torpedoing of the ocean liner, the Lusitania, they had closed down the most extensive scale of this submarine warfare. Submarines continued to attack military shipping, but attacks on civilian shipping had been reduced. And then in order to place pressure on Great Britain to pull out of the war, Germany decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare with the goal of reducing British access to imported food supplies. And the intention was that they would place enough economic pressure on the British government that Britain would pull out of the war before the United States had a chance to enter the war and make a difference in terms of the power that the Allies could place in the field. Unrestricted submarine warfare affected Canadian war wives in one of two ways. First, it caused massive disruptions and interruptions in the transshipment of mail and packages. For soldiers serving in the front lines, regular receipt of letters, particularly from their families, and of packages that usually contained some favorite home baking, lots of socks, pictures of children, loving mementos from home. These were essential to maintaining the morale and good spirits of troops serving in the front lines. And when submarine warfare sent ships to the bottom of the ocean, they sent mail packages to the bottom of the ocean too. One example, in late February 1917, so less than a month after the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, a ship by the name of Laconia was torpedoed. 13 passengers died. 5,000 bags of Canadian mail went to the bottom of the ocean. And so those were letters and packages that soldiers were eagerly anticipating that they never received. For some soldiers, these interruptions gave rise to great anxiety that their families at home had forgotten about them, that they no longer cared how these men were enduring the circumstances of war. One man by the name of David Mclean from Toronto, who from all I can tell was a pretty grumpy character to start with, went for several weeks without word from his wife, and he was furious. He wrote to her, "Well, I haven't got any letters from you tonight, yet Mr. Grant gets his all right. None for me. So after this, I will just write to you when you write to me. I suppose you people over in Canada have such a fine time. You never think of those that are out here putting up with all those hardships for them. But never mind. After the war, things will be different. We will look after ourselves first. So goodbye." Happily for David Mclean, he did receive a package of mail in, when was it? Late March. He received 4 letters. One had been mailed on the 15th of February, one on the 16th, one on the 26th, and one on the 1st of March. And so it had taken more than a month for him to receive this richness of family letters. And the last letter he had received from his wife before this bounty of mail had been sent on the 29th of January. So there were massive disruptions in the transmission of mail to frontline soldiers. Another soldier who has a significant role in my book, Laurie Rogers, is not nearly as grumpy as David Mclean, but he's nonetheless distressed at the absence of mail brought about by these disruptions. And he wrote in mid-March to his wife in Montreal that it was well over a month since she had sent him a Valentine's card, which she had mentioned subsequently, and it never arrived. He speculated, quote, "The big fishes in the sea are enjoying it, or else mermaids have it posted to a rock." So these interruptions placed strains both on the morale of the soldiers and in some instances even on the well-being of the marriage, as soldiers began to fear that their wives had perhaps forgotten them. But interruptions in the mail service also created significant strain and stress and anxiety for the women at home. They too were subjected to these long interruptions. Sometimes they would go for 3 or 4 weeks without any correspondence whatsoever, without knowing what their husband was doing, where he was serving, whether in fact he was still alive. In one case, a woman in Winnipeg by the name of Betty Maisie knew that her husband had arrived in England for training in November of 1916. She knew, based on a letter that she had received sometime in March, that he anticipated being shipped from England to France in advance of the big show. So based on the mail that she had received, all of which was at least a month late from the time that he sent it, she was persuaded at the beginning of April that her husband Will was serving in France. And when she read in the newspapers about the Vimy campaign, she believed that he was there. So these interruptions in mail service are going to add to the uncertainty and the anxiety of Canadian wives. For Canadian war wives who had chosen at some point, mostly in 1916, to relocate to Great Britain, the introduction or the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare will affect them very differently. It will not have the same disruptive effects on mail delivery. They can continue to receive and send letters to the front with considerable efficiency. But the resumption of submarine warfare is going to place enormous stresses on the British government, on Britain's capacity to guarantee the food supply for its population, and is going to prompt the British government to place pressure on Canadian administrative forces in the UK and in Ottawa to bring about the repatriation of Canadian war wives. There were probably 50,000 Canadian wives and children who chose to relocate to the United Kingdom during the war. And as best as I can determine from the evidence that I have at my disposal, the wives of officers and the wives of enlisted men decided to return or to go to Britain for the first time for very different reasons. The wives of officers usually had some form of independent income. They received a more generous separation allowance from the Canadian Army, the CEF, and so they could afford to go to the UK and to live in something close to regular comfort. They had the financial means to do so. And most chose either to locate around the Canadian training bases in Kent, or to relocate into London, where there are whole little colonies of Canadian war wives in very, very elegant parts of the West End of London. By contrast, the wives of enlisted men who chose to go to England or to the UK usually did so because they wanted to relocate with family. These were, in the main, women and their husbands who had immigrated to Canada in the decade before the war, who still had parents and extended family in Britain, and who hoped that being able to reconnect to that family, particularly to their parents, would alleviate some of the hardships and stresses of what we would call single parenting, looking after the children by themselves. So in most cases, the wives of enlisted men went to the UK because they were returning home. And they hoped that they would have access to emotional and economic support from their extended family. But in early 1917, even before the official resumption of submarine warfare, the British government, suffering the same economic stresses that beset all combatant nations in the winter of 16 to 17, began to place pressure on authorities in London and in Ottawa to persuade Canadian wives and their children who had relocated to Britain, to persuade them to go back to Canada. So messages were sent out every month to accompany the separation allowances that were allocated to war wives and their children. Newspaper announcements were placed to remind Canadian war wives temporarily residing in Britain that it was becoming more and more urgent that they think about returning to Canada. And one of the ways in which the argument was made that, you know, it would be a good thing for you to think about going back to Canada right now was that the threat was placed that Canadian wives and dependents who do not intend to permanently reside in Britain should consider the question of their immediate return to Canada unless they are prepared to remain in England for at least 1 year after their husbands have been returned to Canada. So the threat was, at the end of the war, whenever that will be, your husbands will be repatriated and you will have to stay in the UK for another year before you can reunite with your husband and resume married life. Now, in fact, that threat was never realized. Canadian wives who chose to stay in the UK through the end of the war were sent back to Canada in the spring of 1919. But the threat was out there as a way to persuade Canadian wives to think about returning to Canada. But of course, they were being asked to return to Canada at a time when transatlantic ocean voyages were most dangerous. And so war wives were torn between, do I go back now and be a good, obedient citizen, and place myself and my children in danger of being torpedoed? Or do I stay in the UK and risk the possibility that my husband will be repatriated a full year before I can return home? So this placed a great deal of stress and pressure on the Canadian women who had repatriated to the UK for the duration of the war. And one woman who expressed the stresses of her experience living in England and then the challenges of trying to return to Canada was a young woman from Edmonton by the name of Emma Piper. Her husband had enlisted in the summer of 1916, as had so many married men. And she had decided to return to England with her 3 children in October of 1916. And once she got there, she discovered that life was miserable. She found it difficult to find accommodation that was suitable for an adult woman and 3 young children. And as she contemplated the possibility of returning to Canada in early 1917, she wrote to the authorities in Ottawa explaining her circumstances. And she said, since she had arrived in England in 1916, we have not had a minute's comfort. I have been in and out of lodgings 9 times, as no one will let me have rooms for very long, owing to the children's noise. I cannot make dummies of them, and they have had cold ever since we came. Nothing seems to cure them. So whereas many Canadian wives who went to England did find accommodation with their family, Emma lived close to her mother, but not in the same apartment or flat, and found it almost impossible to settle in a way that was comfortable for her and her children. But she had no money, so she was requesting that the government provide an advance on her separation allowance that would allow her to cover the costs of returning to Canada. Those requests were denied, and Emma and her 3 children had to stay in England through the middle of 1917. These circumstances, the daily stresses of managing the family home, the problems of maintaining regular, reassuring connection with one's husband in the field, the difficulties for Canadian wives who were living in England trying to decide whether they should return to Canada or should stay. All of these, quote, daily anxieties were compounded in 1917 by knowledge that Canadian men were serving in a series of important but very, very costly battles. And the effect of this, of the pressures of single parenting, of the disruptions to the mail service and to maintaining contact with one's husband, the problems for women who had relocated to the UK, all of this then creates a combined crisis of anxiety that comes to focus on the question, is my husband alive? And what I want to suggest in these final moments is that we can begin to see in 1917 something approaching perhaps not a pandemic, but maybe an epidemic of psychological distress among Canadian war wives. I don't want to suggest that Canadian war wives had not worried before 1917. As soon as they knew that their husbands were in the front lines, they worried. But because so many married men had enlisted in 1916, because so many of those men were then in a position to be deployed into frontline service in 1917, the scale of this epidemic of psychological distress expands in 1917. And I want to close by giving you 3 examples of how we can tell that Canadian war wives were feeling increasingly on nerve's edge by the spring of 1917. Remember Jenny Hilliar? She was the one whose husband had given her the precise instructions as to how to winterize her home. She did the best she could, but she nonetheless struggled. And by the end of 1916, she decided that maintaining the duplex that she and Harry had purchased as a home and as an investment was no longer viable. Maintaining the upkeep on the home was difficult. She had a small baby to take care of. She had a tenant who was disruptive, who drank too much, and was just giving Jenny more problems than it was worth. So she decided to leave the duplex and rent it out. And she would relocate to be closer to her sisters in another area in central Montreal. She said she was relieved that she had made that decision, even though once she'd left the duplex, she discovered that the pipes had burst. I guess she hadn't put the ash high enough up along the pipes. One of the apartments had flooded. The tenants in the downstairs apartment refused to pay their rent because they were living in an apartment where the ceilings were leaking. And she confessed to her husband, "I don't know how much longer my nerves can stand the strain. Wars, like all things, must end, and nothing really matters if I get you back safe and sound." A little while later, when she was settled in her new apartment, when she had access to her sisters and to her mother, she wrote, "I feel far more contented over here than I did in Ville-et-Mar. I would have lost my reason, I think, if I had stayed there any longer. Everyone says I am looking better now. I have less work, more company." Jenny Hilliar's problems were alleviated temporarily, but her husband was killed in March of 1917, and she had to contend with the prospect of being a war widow. Betty Maisie also struggled through the winter of 16 to 17. She also had worked hard to maintain the family home, to keep it in good trim. And she found in housework a source of temporary alleviation for the combined accumulated stress that she encountered in April of 1917, when she didn't hear from her husband for a full month. Remember that she had last heard from him when he was still in England, and when he had anticipated that he and his company would be sent to France in mid-March of 1917. And then she heard nothing more. And so she believed, reasonably enough, that Will was in France in April of 1917, and that he was a participant at Vimy. And she heard nothing and nothing and nothing. And then, in order to allay, or at least to push to the side, the increasing anxiety about what might have happened to her husband, she engaged in a frenzy of housework. And she washed every wall, she painted them, she painted the pipes, she scrubbed and she cleaned until she had no energy left. As she said, when she recounted this long list of house cleaning chores that she had undertaken in April, "I'm feeling rather tired. But now that the dirt is cleaned out and the place is clean, I can take my time." But this frenzy of housework and spring cleaning never fully put to the side that anxiety about her husband. And then on the 27th of April, she received a letter. And the letter explained that Will had never gone to France. His unit had been quarantined in Britain. I think there was a case of measles. And so he had missed the big show. But the disruptions in mail delivery had meant that Betty didn't know that. She was operating with the presumption that he was in harm's way, whereas in fact, he was sitting in a tent in the south of England. And when she received that letter that she had been waiting for, she broke down. She wrote, "Imagine my surprise to find you are still in England. I don't think I knew how much I had been pushing it till your letter came. I nearly had a fit between the letter and the kids. I was crying, and Shirley ran to get a big handkerchief, and she got one arm around my neck, and she started mopping it off. She says, 'Billy, run, get a dish to catch them,' the tears. And Billy hiked to the pantry and got a bread pan. By this time, I was able to tell him, 'I'll manage now.' 2 days later, knowing that her husband was safe, she was in a calmer state of mind. She said, 'I do not know how we will stand it when you do get over to France. It was hard for the week and a half we thought of you there, but this reaction has helped. Only then, when you're in France, there will be no reaction, only to hope, trust, and pray. I'll stop now. Your letters come oftener now.'" Betty was fortunate. Her husband was invalided home in the summer of 1917, and she could restore herself to a life as a woman who had been a war wife. May Rogers, who had moved into Montreal to be closer to her father, who was, as far as we can tell, a bit of a crotchety old thing, but nonetheless, he was family, knew full well the conditions in which her husband, Laurie, was fighting. He had been in France since early 1916. He had seen heavy battle in June of 1916, and he had described it in heartrending detail in a letter that he sent home when he was on leave in London. And so through the winter of 16 to 17, while she was somewhat more comfortably situated in an apartment in Montreal, she nonetheless worried about Laurie's well-being. She confessed that she wasn't sleeping well. She had persistent headaches, and she said fearfully that she feared she had lost her youthful looks. She was only in her mid-30s, but she confessed to Laurie, already turning gray. Laurie was a sweet fellow. He was the one who thought that the Valentine had been picked up by the mermaids. And he reassured her not to worry about turning gray. He and a lot of his comrades in the front lines were as well. But the cumulative effect of absence and worry and managing the family home took its toll on May Rogers. And as she waited for the possibility of Laurie to be sent home on a furlough, which had been promised to soldiers who had enlisted early in the war, she thought about how happy she would be if only Laurie could come home. And so in October of 1917, knowing that Laurie had survived Vimy, had survived Hill 70, and was now serving as a stretcher bearer at Passchendaele, she began to assemble in good time the box of Christmas goodies that she would send to Laurie as a strong token of her affection and the affection of her two children. The Christmas box included a sweater that her daughter had knit. Even though it wasn't perfect, she asked him to overlook the errors and realize that the sweater contained a lot of love. The Christmas box also included a gift that their son had purchased, saving up his allowance and foregoing the few little treats that he might have purchased for himself in order to give comfort and solace to his father. And she included a letter. And in the letter, she said, "If only I could see you, I think it would make a different woman of me. Loneliness is eating my heart out." Laurie Rogers never received a Christmas box. He was killed on the 30th of October, 1917. He didn't receive the sweater. He didn't receive the gift that his son had saved so carefully for. And he didn't receive the final words of his wife's undying affection. How May Rogers and other women whose husbands were killed in the war then transformed into war widows is a different story, but one that I also examine in Anxious Days and Tearful Nights. Thank you.
Hi, Martha.
Hi.
That was a tremendous talk. Thank you very much. It's so clear that it's obviously a fantastic piece of work that you've put together. I don't need to read the book to be able to tell that, but I think what's so great to hear when historians come in is how much or how much of a connection that historians can make in reading this letter. And I think that comes out so very clear when you're reading some of those quotes from those correspondence between husband and wife. So thank you very much. Before we get into the Q&A portion, I would like to remind everyone that if you really did enjoy this talk, there's so much more to read in Martha's new book that she just alluded to, Anxious Days and Tearful Nights. I've included in the chat the link that you can go to in order to purchase her book, as well as the discount code. So do go to that. Do go to that link if you would like to hear more of what Martha's been talking about tonight. But let's move into the Q&A portion, Martha, because there has been a flood of questions that have come in already, which is just fantastic. I think it's always a sign of how much the crowd enjoys a talk when these questions come flooding in, even before the Q&A portion starts. And I would encourage everyone to keep sending in your questions as we go through this Q&A portion. The first question for you tonight, Martha, comes from a man. I think you may know him. His name is William Copps from Winnipeg.
Okay.
And he talks about how his grandmother was a wife and mother of 4 children that were under 5 when his grandfather left for the war. And so he was wondering, were there any means of support at all for these women when their husbands left? And if there were, what were those supports?
Absolutely important question. Canadian war wives actually had more financial support than was the case, certainly for wives in Britain, Germany, or France. There were 3 separate pools of money that were allocated to Canadian war wives. The first was a separation allowance that was funded by the Canadian government and was ordinarily $20 or $25 a month. On top of that, starting in 1915, every soldier, married or single, had to allocate a certain amount of their monthly pay in what was called assigned pay. And the minimum allocation was $15. In many cases, I've discovered that husbands and fathers with children at home to support allocated more than $15. So there would be, say, $20 in separation allowance, $15 to $20 in assigned pay. And then for the vast majority of Canadian war wives who came from circumstances that we would call working class. So their husbands had been skilled or semi-skilled laborers before the war, probably didn't have a lot in the way of personal savings. They would be allocated or they would be eligible to receive a stipend from the Canadian Patriotic Fund, which was a philanthropic organization that was started as soon as the war started. There was a national organization, and then for reasons I'm not fully clear on, Manitoba had its own affiliated patriotic fund, but its goal was first to raise funds from the general public, and then to allocate these funds to families in such a way as to bring their monthly allowance up to something approaching what would have been the family income before the war. So in most circumstances, that would be a monthly allowance, total separation allowance, assigned pay, patriotic fund money of about $60 a month. And that was actually quite manageable in the first years of the war. And then by the time inflation hit and we see, you know, the high price of coal and fuel, for example, those sources of income proved to be less and less adequate to meet the actual demands of maintaining a family.
Thanks, Martha. The next question comes from Linda Clark. I'm not sure where Linda's coming from, but there's a couple of questions that kind of have a regionalized aspect or a regional aspect to it. So why don't we get into those? Linda's question pertains to the prairies, and she wonders how in particular the struggles of, you know, homesteading families and when husbands would leave, things like the lack of running water or having neighbors that are not really neighborly in the sense that they're so far away. Were their experiences unique, and what sort of challenges did they experience that might have been a bit different from someone in, you know, central Canada?
Yeah, a really, really good question. And in fact, a large part of my book builds upon a database that I collected of approximately 300 Canadian war wives from Manitoba. In part because I grew up in Manitoba, so it's a place that I know, but in part because Manitoba had an exceptionally high rate of enlistment for married men. So it provided me with a very broad understanding of how the women that they left behind experienced the war. In general, recruitment of married men was much more concentrated in the cities than it was in rural Manitoba or Saskatchewan. It's not to say that farm wives didn't have to contend with some of these challenges, and I've come across evidence in archives in Manitoba that have stressed how difficult it was for women to maintain the family farm, especially if they were also looking after very young children. But the larger segment of the married wives, of the wives whose husbands went to war from, at least from Manitoba, came from Winnipeg. And I also was able to track that in many cases, the women who did come from rural communities, whether from farms or from smaller towns like Portage la Prairie or Verdun or Hartney, which is where my grandparents were, often would move into either Winnipeg or Brandon for the duration of the war. So Canadian war wives moved a lot, either to make their living circumstances easier. They weren't having to maintain the family farm. They might be renting it out perhaps to another farmer. Or if they were moving, they might be moving closer to extended family, to other adult siblings, for example. So It's not that rural women were unaffected by this experience, but in many cases, they adjusted their lives so that for the duration of the war, they lived in larger towns or in cities.
Thanks, Martha. I'm going to try to combine a number of questions here. One coming from Tim Cook from Ottawa, Ontario. Another coming from Kevin Spooner, actually the director of the Laurier Military Center here in Waterloo. And
I'm getting scared at this point.
And their questions kind of are around the idea of sources. And I found it when I saw your book actually in the McGill Queen's University Press catalog, I was intrigued too about your source base. And as soon as I got the book, I kind of quickly flipped through to the back to check your footnotes because of course, as we know, as First World War historians, there are so many letters that get sent back home that are kept for posterity just for the ability to keep them stored in a box somewhere or an attic or something like that. But obviously those letters that come from wives to husbands are a lot more difficult or rare because soldiers didn't have a place to keep their letters like their wives did. So I guess, and I'm kind of bringing these questions together from these various angles is, where did you find these sources? And how were you able to pull out the experiences of wives when those voices aren't necessarily directly and explicitly there in a lot of cases?
Yeah, I mean, that was the big challenge. And I think what became evident was that there's a corpus of soldiers' letters, and Tim has used them extensively, so he knows exactly how rich they are. That in the past have been used very effectively to assess the way in which Canadian men experienced the war. But when I looked at those letters, I also discovered that the war wasn't the only subject of concern to the men writing these letters. So I focused, as you know, only on married men. And many of their letters are really about things that are both mundane and very important. How are the kids? Are they sick? Do you have enough money? Are you getting along well with your in-laws? Is my mother-in-law still a pain? All these kinds of things. So the letters are actually conversational in a way, even though regrettably we don't have the letter that the soldier is responding to. But if you read through these letters really carefully, you can discover that soldiers are always worried when they have heard that their children are sick. They are, as we can tell with Harry Hilliar's letters, they are very worried about how their wives are going to manage the tasks of household management. They engage in conversation about, well, yeah, it probably would be a good idea if you moved to Vancouver to stay with your parents for the winter. That way, life is going to be easier. And yeah, we know that your parents are kind of a pain, but all in all, you'll be better off. So when we start sort of looking for those sources of evidence, we can sort of infer the kinds of questions and topics that their wives were writing about. So it's a kind of reading between the lines of the soldiers' letters. There are clearly a few letters, like the Betty Maisie letter, like the one that May Rogers sent that we have because it was sent home with Laurie's personal effects. So those are wonderful. They're gold mines, but they're very, very rare. And one of the things that I discovered when I worked on the Canadian sources that really made it different from when I'd worked previously on French sources is that because French soldiers were allowed to go home, they would bring their wives' letters home with them for safe storage. So they would say, these letters mean the world to me, but I also want to preserve them. So when I come home on leave, or when my buddy who lives in the next village over comes home on leave, I'm going to send them with him and you should hold on to them. So there was a way of preserving the wives' letters in France that just wasn't open to Canadian war wives. But the big question that really intrigued me was what was it like? How did women who had been war wives adjust to becoming war widows? And we have, of course, almost no records for them until, thank you to the National Archives in Ottawa, they digitized all of the personnel records of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So when I created this database of approximately 300 Canadian soldiers who were married at the beginning of the war and who lived in Manitoba, I was then able to go through those records and identify how many times did this wife move? How much money did she have? If she moved back to England, where did she stay? And so I could sort of track that kind of information. And then I became an addict of Ancestry.com in being able to sort of track when a particular Canadian family left the UK and moved to England, moved to Canada, when a Canadian war wife left Canada, and what ship did she sail on from Montreal or from Halifax, and where did she arrive when she got to the UK? So I spent, I don't know how many hours mining these digitized sources, census records, shipping records, and so forth, to sort of create a composite picture of what life was like before these women became widowed.
Let's keep going along with sources, Martha. I'm fascinated by it, and the crowd seems like they are too. This next question comes from Catherine Sarandinska from Stratford, Ontario. And she wonders if you were able to take a look at any war wives' journals or diaries as well as the course.
I tried. I really, I wished I had found some. I made a trip just to Montreal because I came across a reference to a Canadian wife journal that was held at McGill, and discovered that it was actually really boring. It was more like a ledger of, I did this today, I did that today, and so forth. But it wasn't the kind of introspective diary that we think of. So regrettably, I wasn't able to locate any. And if people know of Canadian war wives records, I would love to hear about them. I also, this is sort of a tangent, but those of you who might have already read the book have probably sussed out that part of my interest in this story derives from trying to understand the experience of my great-grandmother, whose husband left to go to war in 1915 and who was killed in October of 1916. And I learned subsequently that my grandparents, particularly my grandmother, had a box of letters and maybe other materials, who knows, that had been preserved by my great-grandmother. And these were probably letters that her husband had written to her, probably not things that she had written to him. And when my grandparents moved from Bowmanville into Oshawa, I think this is how the story goes, my grandmother looked at this box and said, who needs it? And threw them away. So clearly, whatever history gene I have, I didn't inherit it from my grandmother.
Maybe we can keep going off of that point there, Martha, about how you kind of got into this, into the study of Canadian war wives in general. There's a question here from Kirsten Hipkiss from Niagara, and she's just wondering what encouraged you or got you interested in this topic that you explored in your book.
Really two things. So as I have just suggested, part of it was very personal. I had known for a long time, I don't remember when I first knew this, that my great-grandfather had served in the war and had been killed. I knew that experience profoundly and very directly affected my grandfather, who was the oldest boy in the family and therefore had to assume responsibility to help his mother after his father had been killed. So that was really, really part of my sort of inner family knowledge. But I also, as you'd mentioned, Eric, I started thinking about the First World War from the vantage point of France. And in my second book, I'd had the great good fortune of discovering this extraordinary collection of letters written by a French soldier and his wife, probably more than 2,000 letters. They wrote each other every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, and most of the letters survived. And so I was able to work through that extraordinary collection and get a very, very deep sense of how French soldiers and their wives connected. And coming out of that book project, I was curious to know whether the French experience was unique, or another way of thinking about it, whether distance from the fighting lines mattered in how soldiers and their wives maintained connections. So French soldiers were allowed to go home on leave. They had an extraordinarily efficient postal service that allowed them to write a letter and have it delivered within 3 days. They could receive letters from the front line, from their home in the same window. French wives were so insistent that the mail service worked efficiently that they protested to local authorities. In one instance I came across, they demanded that the train service from one sort of medium-sized town in the southwest of France to one smaller town in the southwest of France be changed so that they could get the letters by the end of the day rather than the next morning. So they were really attuned to the idea of maintaining very close connection through letter writing, but also through leave. And so I was really curious, as not from the personal angle, but from the professional angle, to think about how distance shaped the experience of wartime marriage. And because of my connections with Canada, because that's where I grew up, that's where I have my family, it made sense for me to pursue that question by thinking about the Canadian experience. I mean, I could have done the Australian one, I guess, but that would have been even more expensive on my travel account. But it also allowed me to spend many trips, particularly in Ottawa, but also in Winnipeg, sort of combing through archives and also visiting with family. So really the project is an expression of both personal and professional interests and questions converging.
There are a few questions here, Martha. Some of our good friends and longtime patrons of the center, Ken Irvin out in Guelph, Ontario, and Rich Mills in Kitchener as well. They have a question, and I think there's a number of others. There's so many coming in. I'm sorry, I can't sort through them all. But one of the questions that they have is about these Dear John letters. And I'm curious, Martha, if you could tell the folks what these Dear John letters were, and if you came across a number of them in your research.
So a Dear John letter traditionally is a letter sent by a wife or girlfriend to a soldier in the front lines saying, our relationship is over. As I suggested, there were moments when the married men for whom I had records wondered if that was in fact what was happening, that their wives had just decided it was over and they hadn't got the letter yet. I have not come across any evidence. I haven't seen a Dear John letter. I haven't seen a reference to a Dear John letter among married men, which isn't to say that probably some marriages didn't collapse because of and due to the war. In some instances, soldiers would intervene with the Canadian Patriotic Fund. They might have heard a rumor to the effect that, and remember here I'm talking only about wives, so I don't know what the experience with girlfriends would have been. They would have heard a rumor that their wife was canoodling with some shirker back home. And then the Patriotic Fund would investigate, and they would write back and said, no, it's just, it's malicious, evil gossip, and there's no substance to it. Interestingly, what I did find evidence for, and this kind of flips that question on its head, if you don't mind, is of sort of the equivalent of a Dear John letter, which was when soldiers at the end of the war just didn't bother to go home. And so they deserted their wives, sometimes because they had found a girlfriend in England or in France or in Belgium, sometimes just because they didn't want to stay married any longer. So the issue of marital desertion becomes a topic of some concern in Canada and also in other wartime countries, because there does seems to be evidence of what you might think of as the Dear John letter in reverse.
Martha, I've got another question, and a great question from Sarah Hart in Ottawa. She always asks good questions when she comes to our talks. She has a question about otherness, in the sense of, war wives obviously had many different identities beyond just war wives. Some were English Canadian, some were French Canadian, Indigenous, Black. And she wonders if you had any sense of letters or correspondence or even stories about non-English Canadian war wives, and if their experiences might have been distinct from English Canadian war wives.
Two answers to that. One is one of the, I like to think sort of the star characters of the book is a woman from sort of north of Ottawa, Angeline Maheu, whose husband was French Canadian, and she was Indigenous, and her extended family lived in Maniwaki. And she was an amazing woman. She had a bunch of kids, 5, if I remember correctly. She lived in a very remote lumber community north of Maniwaki. It doesn't even exist anymore. It was flooded to create a reservoir. And it's clear from her husband's letters that she is a woman of amazing resilience. She, buys animals so that she can guarantee that her kids are going to have meat. She manages the family home. She looks after the children. And at the same time, of course, she's worrying about her husband and her 2 brothers, both of whom are Indigenous and both of whom were serving in the front lines. And so her experience really creates this sense of this extraordinary woman. I mean, my admiration, in fact, for nearly all of these women is sort of unbounded. But Angeline really emerges as kind of one of the heroes of the book. The only other evidence that I had of Indigenous women was based on secondary sources that other Canadian historians have used. One example was that a group of Indigenous women from James Bay chose to relocate further south expressly so that they would have more regular access to the mail service. So where they were living was so remote that even the delays that we've seen for places like Montreal and Winnipeg would have been intensified many, many times over. I tried to discern how Indigenous women in Manitoba experienced the war, and I knew that Indigenous men had enlisted, but because of the marital laws, we didn't have the same access, say, to to marriage license records and so forth. So I was really sort of stymied in trying to sort of track what their experiences were, other than to see that in the cases that I was aware of, in many ways they replicated those of the English Canadian women. They relocated to be closer to family and to tap into sort of the emotional resources of an extended family. So that was what I was able to discern.
Got more questions coming in here, Martha, and we got about 5 minutes left because I don't want to go any longer than 8:30. So maybe we will do 2 more questions and then we'll wrap things up. Does that sound good?
Good with me.
Okay. So I'm gonna try to condense a bunch of questions together again, so I can get as many people as I possibly can. So the next question, Martha, is kind of in the realm of censorship, whether state censorship or self-censorship.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of questions. Kevin Reinhardt from Kitchener, John Sargent from London, and sorry, Rich Mills from Kitchener. That was, he didn't ask that previous question. This was his question as well. And it's around censorship. And I'm wondering if war wives had a sense of what was really going on the war front. Were they aware of things like the horrendous casualty rates that were kind of coming back, obviously in the early years in 1915, but also moving forwards into 1917 and 1918? And when soldiers wrote home, did they tend to be honest about what was going on, or did they, hide or use language that might underemphasize the real realities of the war front?
Excellent questions. The letters that Canadian soldiers wrote home were subject to the same censorship regulations as soldiers in the British Expeditionary Force, which meant that their sort of immediate junior officer, so if you were a private, then your lieutenant, would be responsible for reading and passing your letter. And they would X out words that they weren't supposed to see and so forth. And this did have what we would call a chilling effect. I've come across a lot of references from soldiers saying, I wish I could speak more honestly. And actually what they're more reluctant to talk about is love and affection. So because they don't want people eavesdropping on their sort of private correspondence. So there is formal censorship, there's also self-censorship, but there are also ways in which soldiers got around that and purposefully got around that. So usually about once a month, though this is very irregular, soldiers would be given a green envelope, and this would allow them to write a letter home that was not subjected to the censorship of their immediate commanding officer. So the guy that you're sitting in a trench with doesn't get to read your signs of affection to your wife and kids. And so some soldiers did use these green envelopes as a way to be more openly expressive, both about their affection, but also about the war. I've also found evidence that soldiers didn't need these green envelopes to speak quite openly about combat. And so the case I just mentioned of Angeline Maheu, her husband survived the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and wrote home these bone-chilling graphic descriptions of not only what he participated in, what he saw, bodies all over no man's land, but also some of the things that he did, like bayoneting German soldiers and so forth. And that clearly got, if his commanding officer read it, he didn't object to it being sent home. And perhaps it was because by this time Frank had proven himself to be a good and loyal soldier, and the officer was giving him some slack. I really don't know. I just know that these letters made their way home. On other occasions, soldiers, because Canadian soldiers never got to go home to Canada on leave, they got to go to the UK on leave. And so, for instance, Laurie Rogers, who survived the Battle of Mount Sorel in June of 1916, didn't write about it in the immediate aftermath, but when he was on leave staying in a hotel in London, then he did. And he gave May Rogers a quite frank and heartrending description of what it was like. And because Laurie was a stretcher bearer, particularly the anguish of having to deal with critically wounded, brutally wounded soldiers. So Canadian wives didn't receive the kind of regular updates on war and combat and the conditions at the front that I have found was the case in French letter writing, where they circumvented the censorship on a regular basis. But the censorship was not as watertight as we would have imagined it would be. And so Canadian wives did learn over the course of several months, not everything, obviously. They never would know what it was really like to be a soldier, but they knew enough to be worried. They knew enough that this was pretty god-awful.
I want to squeeze in one last question, Martha. I know it's after 8:30, but there is, like I said, so many questions, so many good questions. So this last one I'll put to you is from Ann Thompson. And she wonders, she asks about those that actually did suffer breakdowns. You mentioned that there were a lot of women that that you found in your research that were kind of on the edge,
Yeah.
right? She wonders about those that actually did suffer breakdowns, and if there were sort of any long-term effects upon the marriage when husbands returned home.
Really good question. Obviously, the evidence is going to be sketchy. I have evidence that there's an extraordinary collection of materials in what's called the Soldiers' Deserted Wives Fund in Winnipeg, which was a fund created just for Canadian wives in Manitoba whose husbands didn't come home. And in those files, there is evidence of women who did have nervous breakdowns, what they would call nervous breakdowns at the time. In one case, a woman was actually sent at the expense of the Manitoba Patriotic Fund to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester in Minnesota, because she had so many physiological complaints that they wanted to see, what the real problem was. Well, what people have subsequently learned is that many of those physiological complaints, headaches and poor vision and various other things, were in fact a consequence of psychological distress. And in that case, the doctors examined her and said, there's nothing wrong with her eyesight as such. She's suffering from like severe mental strain. My recollection in that case, my recollection is obviously that this information comes out of the sources about women whose husbands deserted them. So there's no way of really telling how that would have affected a marriage where the husband did come home. So the evidence that I was able to unearth is very limited, but there is, I think, enough to show that women, in some cases, suffered psychological distress and found means to deal with it. So a lot found comfort in religion. Interestingly enough, something as mundane as knitting is actually now known to be a very good antidote to psychological stress. It just kind of relaxes you. So women who would gather in knitting circles, whether they were organized by the Patriotic Fund or just locally, would have ways of sort of keeping that level of psychological stress under control. But as I said, the only evidence that I've found where women couldn't keep it under control come from these records where the marriage had basically fallen apart, independently of that.
Well, Martha, I want to say thank you very much for a fantastic talk tonight. It was such a treat to have you, such a treat to have you know, someone from the United States come in, but also even more of a treat, someone from the United States who's born in Canada and doing research on Canada. It's always lovely to bring in folks from across North America and elsewhere, but to know that they have a place in their hearts for Canada is always good to hear from us. So before I formally wrap things up, again, I would recommend everyone to go and take a look at Martha's book, Anxious Days and Tearful Nights, which you can find on McGill Queen's University Press website. I've included the link in the chat. If you do want to purchase it, don't forget that discount code MQF2 that you can enter at the checkout. For those who really enjoyed tonight, and maybe this is your first time coming to a Laurie Military History webinar series, I would really highly recommend you go to our website, CanadianMilitaryHistory.ca, and subscribe, CanadianMilitaryHistory.ca/subscribe. And if you do that, you will be given kind of periodic emails about future events, future webinars such as this one or ones like this one, publications coming out of the Laurie Military Center, and other things like conferences and podcasts and blog posts that all of you can access if you subscribe. Our next event is going to take place at the end of March, on March 31st. It's going to be actually in the afternoon this time. Normally we're a 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time start, but because we're going to be having Lucy Noakes from the University of Essex come, we have had to move that time earlier to 1 p.m. So it's on Wednesday, March 31st, but it's going to be at 1 p.m. as opposed to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it's actually going to be our concluding event for the winter webinar series lineup. And it's going to be a panel or a roundtable discussion on new directions in the history of the Second World War. So that's going to include, like I said, Lucy Noakes, Sarah Glassford from the University of Windsor, Graham Broad from King's College at Western University, and it's going to be hosted by one of our good colleagues, Jeff Hayes, at the University of Waterloo. You can go and register for that event at CanadianMilitaryHistory.ca/webinar. That's all I have for you tonight. Martha, again, I really want to thank you very much for a tremendous talk. And we hope someday that we'll be able to bring you back soon for the next book or the next set of articles that are going to come out.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I've just loved doing this. Thank you.
Perfect. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.